Welcome to the fifth episode of the ongoing series, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness, here on Sfarim Chatter. And I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode, we discuss the history of the Red Jews, or the Rote Juden, in German and Yiddish literature, as the 10 Lost Tribes came to be referred to, as well as the famous Ma'aseh Akdamus, which is a legend centered around the Akdamus Piyut that we say on Shavuos, where Rav Meir Shatz of Worms allegedly travels to the land of the 10 tribes, across the Sambatyon to get a magician from the Lost Tribes to come and fight for the Jews, protect the Jews of Worms, and Rav Meir cannot come back because he can only cross the Sambatyon on Shabbos because of Pikuach Nefesh, but he can't return, and vice versa with the Lost Tribes magician, and that's the legend, and we discussed that as well here, besides the Red Jews. The corporate sponsor of this series is, as always, Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler replacements, main sewer line snakeouts, camera ink main lines to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1, and tell them you heard about them on the Sfarim Chatter podcast, and thank you to them again for their continued support of the podcast. This individual episode of this series is sponsored by Ma'aseh Press. Ma'aseh Press, which is renowned for its expert editors and designers, brings together top Jewish minds. Their influential books captivate a worldwide audience, sparking meaningful conversations across our community. Check out their many titles at mosaicpress.com or your local Judaica store, including the new book, From Creation to Redemption, which in this insightful and original work, Rav Chaim Willis illustrates how the weekly Haftarah imparts fundamental ideas that are relevant to our own lives and the times we are living in today, through exploring the connection between the poetic, beautiful, and complicated Haftarahs and the standard Torah portion we read every week in Shul. Get your copy now at mosaicpress.com and use the code CHATTER, CHATTER, for an exclusive 15% off. And you can find links in the show's notes below. To sponsor an individual episode on Sfarim Chatter or in this series, please email me sfarimchatter@gmail.com, as well as check out the links in the show's notes below. There will be essays and articles and book reviews and things like that on the Sfarim Chatter Substack. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. It's free. Substack, for those that aren't familiar, is a kind of blog where you get it emailed to your inbox, or you can go on Substack. There's also a paid option, monthly or yearly, which really is to support the podcast. And I appreciate anyone that does so. And if you do, there will be some bonus content from time to time for paying subscribers. And there's a link to subscribe to the Substack in the show's notes. Additionally, there's also a Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community. There's a link in the show's notes. There's an admin-only chat if you just want to see new books, new Sfarim links, and things like that. And then there's two associated chats, which sometimes can get busy, which talk about, one is for the podcast-related stuff, one is for Sfarim and that kind of thing. And finally, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, whether it's 24/6 or Apple or Spotify. And if you listen on Apple, if you can rate and write a review, very much appreciate it. It helps the podcast search and those kind of things. So I do appreciate it. Finally, if you have any feedback on anything in the series, don't like, and just what you think in general, you can reach out to me. If you're on the WhatsApp chat, you'll see my number. You can comment on WhatsApp. You can send an email, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. And I hope you enjoy this fifth episode of the series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast and another episode in the ongoing series here on Sfarim Chatter, 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. On this episode of the podcast, in this episode of the series, I'm going to be joined by Professor Rebekka Voss, who is the Associate Professor of Jewish History at the Goethe University, Frankfurt, and we'll be discussing the Red Jews, the Rote Juden, which we discussed on our other episode, which may or may not come out before this one, but about her previous book, Disputed Messiahs. And this is a recent book that she printed also, so it fits into the series, and it's a brand new book titled Sons of Saviors, The Red Jews in Yiddish Culture, published by Penn University Press. So thank you, Professor Voss, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to speak about the Red Jews. Always a fun topic.
Yeah, I usually start off, how do you become interested in something? But I think here, I'll wait on that for a minute. What are the Red Jews, or the Rote Juden? I think listeners listening are probably, what, Red Jews? What is that?
Red Jews, of course, everybody knows who speaks Yiddish, are the 10 lost tribes of Israel in Yiddish, which who in modern Yiddish are until this day are called the Rote Jidele, the Rote Jidele, the little red Jews. So yeah, they are the 10 lost tribes. So you're right, it fits perfectly to your series.
And we'll dive into how they became known as Red Jews, how the Aseret Shvatim went to that. Okay, but how did you become interested in that?
When I was working on my dissertation on Jewish and Christian messianism during the Reformation era, I was trying to read everything I could find on Jewish messianism in the 16th century in Germany. And then I also came across the Yiddish legend about the Red Jews, and I read it. And I was like, wait a minute, I read something similar in a wonderful book by Andrew Gow, which is also called The Red Jews. It's about the Christian legend of the Red Jews. And then I saw that there's something to say about them, about the Red Jews in Jewish culture and Yiddish literature. So there's also, as you mentioned, there's a chapter in my first book, Disputed Messiahs. And in this book, I'm taking the Red Jews up to modern times, and I'm looking at basically at the story itself and the broader implications. But I found it already when I was a PhD student. The fascinating tale about the Red Jews.
And there is stories here. We'll get to Ma'aseh Akdamus or Meir Shatz. Listeners may be familiar in other things. But what's interesting about your book, and this episode in the series is that a lot of the other episodes, Eldad Hadani, David Ruveni, Menashe Ben Israel, Antonio Di Montezinos, whatever, are more stories that happened. Whereas this one is more of a literary construct or oral construct, some sort of construct that as we'll talk about, the Aseret Shvatim, 10 lost tribes become associated with Red Jews. That's what they're called. And we have all sorts of other interesting things. So that's kind of a unique thing about this topic worth pointing out. So why red? Why not green or yellow or something else?
Actually, I also did find the green Jews in the end in a parody, but why red? It's when you look at the color red in medieval color symbolism, it's a color which has, like all medieval color symbolism, has ambivalent meaning. So red could be a positive color, could mean love, for example. For Christian, it would mean Christ's passion. But also red was mostly actually perceived as a negative color, as the color of sin, as the color of war, bloodshed, all this. And you mentioned before, the Red Jews are a construct, an imagination, an imagined people. And they come up sometime in the late 13th century in Germany among Jews and Christians, and both associated the Red Jews with the color red, partly because of this color symbolism, because they symbolized, as I said, bloodshed, for example. So maybe we talk first about the Christian construct, why the Christians called the 10 lost tribes red. For them, the 10 lost tribes were the army of the Antichrist. So it was something, a people which was inherently negative. They were feared, the 10 lost tribes or the Red Jews in Christian imagination, to come at the end of times, rush into Europe and kill the Christians. And there you can see, or you can understand why in Christian imagination they were colored red, because they would shed Christian blood, and they were feared. And also there's another important aspect to it. There are also in the Christian view, the Red Jews are identified with Edom, which has the same root as Adam in Hebrew, red, and it comes from this verse in Genesis where it says, "2 nations are in your womb; the elder shall serve the younger." And we know the elder is Esau, Edom, and the younger is Jacob, Israel. So both Jews and Christians identified themselves as Israel, Jacob, and identified the other as sort of the religiously speaking, the loser, Edom. So for Christians, it was clear the Jews are Edom. And this also translated into calling this fictional Jewish people the red Jews, because they were feared and they were Jewish, so they would be equated with Edom.
Which is a fascinating thing, because in Jewish, tradition, the other way is that the Christians are, Rome, and then the Christians, everyone's depicted as Edom, not the Jews. This is kind of, like you said, everyone wants to be the winner, not the loser, as depicted in the Bible and the Torah. So what you're saying also is that this whole construct of red Jews and associating the lost tribe with the red Jews, does that come from the Christians? Is that originally a Christian thing that eventually gets reappropriated by the Jews later?
That's a very good question. We cannot definitely say in which language, whether in German or in Yiddish, the red Jews pop up first. The oldest texts I have are German texts about the red Jews from the late 13th century. But from Jewish sources, it seems like around the same time, the term was also appropriated or adopted among Jews for the 10 tribes, Yiddish-speaking Jews. So I can say it was a shared term, a shared imagination, sometimes from the 13th century, but I cannot say who adopted it from who. What I definitely can say that one group always was in dialogue with the other when using the term, because it could be that Jews used the term red in relation to the 10 tribes first, because it is said in the story of Eldad Hadani, and I know that there's also an episode on it in your series, it is said that the sons of Moses are clad in red, they're wearing red garments, and the sons of Moses are the 10 tribes. So it could be that the Christians were familiar with Eldad and then took the color from there, but this we cannot say.
So whichever way it started, the Christians used it to view the lost tribes in a negative light, and the Jews end up using it to view them in a positive light. And it's worth discussing, how do the Jews view it? Because, as you said, you already mentioned the negative connotation of red that gets associated in the Middle Ages, and that gets associated, therefore, the Christian eyes with the lost tribes. But how do the Jews use red to view the lost tribes?
Actually, they make those creators of the Yiddish story, they make an ingenious move, because they play on the term in the Bible admoni. Because in the Bible, you find the word admoni, radio, red, exactly 3 times. One time with regard to Edom, who is Esau is described as red. And the other 2 times, it refers to David. So what the Yiddish story does is it reevaluates the value of the color red as positive by connecting it to David. Because we know, of course, David is the forerunner of the Messiah, and he's the victorious king of Israel. So by connecting the red Jews to the hero David, they, in the Jewish imagination, they can be a positive figure of identification again.
And I think it's worth pointing out about the Christians, just going back for a minute, that you have the, this is in your first book, I believe, and here also, where you have the stained glass. It's really cool to see in the church in Frankfurt an der Oder from, I think it's the 14th century, right? Or if it's not older.
No, you're right. It's from the mid to end 14th century. Yeah, it's like, I agree. It's if you ever come to Frankfurt an der Oder, I think that's the most interesting thing to see, because we have a church here, St. Mary's Church, and this church is unique for its stained glass windows. I think they are 13 meters high, so it's gigantic stained glass windows, beautiful work of art. And one depicts the creation, the other depicts the story of Jesus, and the other one depicts the story of the Antichrist. And then there are few windows depicting the red Jews, because, as I mentioned briefly before, in Christian apocalyptic thought, the red Jews are the army of the Antichrist. And then in the stained glass windows, we have depictions of them being waiting for the Antichrist and then being fetched by the Antichrist. So this is monumental, and it's great to see, because when you come to the church when there's light shining through the windows, you can see the red Jews with their red faces and red garments from afar, because it's constructed in the way that the light breaks through this window, that the red Jews appear in a very bright red color.
I'll try to find the link for that. There must be a link online and put it in the show's notes. The listeners can just click on that to see the picture, and then you could really get like you're saying, a feel of how it was really depicted in the Antichrist. And I think we don't have to explain that. We don't have to go more into the kind of Christian thought and how the red Jews were portrayed negatively in that. But something on the Jewish angle, and as you mentioned, it's the Yiddish literature, really. It's not the Hebrew literature coming out of Germany at this time. It's in the Yiddish literature in Germany. And so the Jews, as you said, they're associated with Admoni, with David, and they're portrayed, therefore, positively, the fact that they're called red Jews, not in a negative way. It's a very positive thing.
Yeah, it is. Maybe one word on you mentioned Hebrew and Yiddish and German. It's important to note that the legend or the term and the image of the red Jews we only have in the German-speaking areas. So we have it in German, but we do not have it in Latin or any other European vernacular. And we have it in Yiddish, but we do not have it in Hebrew. So it's really a folkloristic or vernacular term and image shared by Jews and Christians in the German-speaking lands.
Now, how do the Jews, or the Yiddish German literature, how do they view these red Jews? They call them red Jews. Are they viewed as kind of red? Are they like barbaric warriors? They're coming to save them. They're strong. And you could also say, I don't know, I think we mentioned briefly, but how do the Christians view them? How does each side view them in their imaginary mind?
Let's start again with the Christians, because in the Christian culture, we do have pictures. You mentioned the pictorial depictions. So you mentioned the church windows in Frankfurt an der Oder, but we also have paintings in manuscripts, and we have illustrations in manuscripts and also prints. And there you can see the red Jews. They are envisioned as having red hair, red faces, and red garments to sort of visualize their aggression, their dangerousness. So in the Yiddish context, unfortunately for the early modern period and medieval period, we don't have any actual depictions of the red Jews. But from the textual sources I have, we can infer that Jews also imagined the red Jews as having red hair or red garments or red faces. So the imagination, how they looked, is very similar. And you ask how the Jews envisioned the red Jews. They envisioned them, first of all, similar to how their Christian counterparts would imagine them, as strong, mighty warriors, because they had to be strong. I mean, they are the 10 lost tribes. And as you probably discuss in the other episodes of the series, the 10 lost tribes are a mighty tribe of warriors. So the red Jews are first and foremost warriors, but I don't want to rush to Ma'aseh Akdamus. So all in all, the depiction is very similar. They look the same in both cultures, and they are envisioned as mighty warriors. And also in the beginning, you said the red Jews are a literary construct. Yes, of course, but at the same time, in the pre-modern mind, they were understood as a political nation, as a nation which existed somewhere in the distant reaches of Asia, where nobody has been yet. So also on world maps, Christian world maps, we find the red Jews where they lived. So yeah, they were imagined as a warrior nation, basically.
Right, and that's you mentioned Ma'aseh Akdamus, which is something that we'll get to, of course, and that plays a very big part over here. But as you mentioned, they are like considered warriors. Now, what about, before we get to Ma'aseh Akdamus, this is kind of the early period here, like the Middle Ages. What about as we get to the Reformation? How do they, and we'll get later to how they're viewed in modernity, but just to the Reformation time before we'll jump back to Ma'aseh Akdamus, I just want to finish up on that. Like, are they still depicted the same way? Or does it change the Red Jews? And again, this could be in either side, because here we're going to keep going to Christian, to the Jewish side, both sides.
You clearly read my book. Yes, there is a change. What happens, it's really interesting. In the Christian world, in the German Christian world, after about 300 years, the Red Jews lost grip. They around 1600, they slowly disappeared from German literature, from German culture. And as I argue in my book, this happened in a complex process of recoding. And one part of this process it happened in the Reformation time. So one part of the process was what I call a visual crisis during the Reformation period. That in the Reformation, Luther, for example, and other reformers, they prioritized hearing God's word instead of seeing. So one part of the argument I make in the book is that because they basically fell out of favor. It was a different literary taste or different taste of understanding. Slowly becoming being created in the world of the Reformation, and another part which is more concrete and more palpable, that the Ottoman Turks who advanced towards Europe in the late Middle Ages, early modern period, they were identified with the 10 lost tribes or with the Red Jews. And at some point, the Turks in the Christian mind made more sense to them as an apocalyptic enemy than the Red Jews. So the Red Jews also in this sense, they were not so important anymore, because all the fears Christians would have of the end of times were not projected on the Red Jews anymore, but on the Turks. And the third aspect, or the third development, which we see in the late Middle Ages, in the 16th century, is that there was a shift towards ethnography, describing newly discovered peoples, where they lived, what were their rituals, their customs. And we also here find the 10 tribes of the Red Jews. And then at some point they're connected to the Red Sea, and in other texts they are described as being black, so black Jews. So in short, what happened over the 16th century was that this term, which was an emblem before in Christians' thought for this dangerous Jewish army of the Antichrist, this term became a bit arbitrary, because those Jews could be black or they could be red, they could live beyond the Sambatyon or in the Red Sea. And so then I argue, this icon didn't work anymore. So that's why it was lost gradually in the Christian world.
What role, if any, does the competing Christian legend, let's call it competing, of Prester John play into this? Or does it play any role in this at all throughout the centuries? Or, there's also an episode in the series on Prester John. I don't know if Prester John, does it play into the Red Jews at all? Because that's also something in, as you said, the Red Jews were always in the mind of the Jews and of the Christians. Was a political thing. It wasn't just imaginary. Well, it wasn't imaginary, but it was like a real kind of imagined thing. And Prester John, we find in the sources, is the same in a lot of ways. But was that also the case in Germany, in the German-speaking lands, or not really?
No, it does play or it's connected, let's say, to the legend of the Red Jews, because the Christians believed Prester John to be the ruler over the 10 lost tribes. So there were the 10 lost tribes were the vessels, basically, of Prester John and the Christian imagination. And what the Yiddish adoption or adaptation of the Red Jews does, or reappropriation, this Yiddish legend also rewrites sort of the interpretation of Prester John, because there are some versions of the Red Jews story in the 16th century which clearly have the Red Jews fight against Prester John in the Yiddish. And here, of course, they are victorious over Prester John. So here it's an answer to the Christian interpretation, basically saying, hey, no, not Prester John, he's not invincible. It's the Red Jews who can be victorious over Prester John. So yes, it does play into this legend too.
One more question before we get to Ma'aseh Akdamus, kind of burying that, the very important part here. But where are the Red Jews located in these legends, in these writings? Where do they depict the Red Jews, or do they depict them in a variety of places?
Yes, I mean, I mentioned a few of them. In general, like the 10 tribes, they are depicted or imagined to live beyond the river Sambation, the river which is impassable for Jews on the Shabbat. It's only quiet then, but then of course Jews cannot get over it. And during the other weeks, the other days of the weeks, its waves are so high and it carries stones, so nobody can cross over it. So since the Red Jews are the 10 lost tribes, they live beyond the Sambation. But also in some sources they are identified as living beyond the mountains of darkness, beyond the gates of Alexander, who enclosed, according to the Alexander legend, the barbarian nations. Sometimes since the late 15th century, they're also depicted or imagined as living on an island in the Red Sea. We find this in both Yiddish sources and in Christian sources. And as I said, they are often on world maps, they are imagined or they're depicted as living in Asia, northeastern Asia.
So now we can get to the Ma'aseh Akdamus story, and it's important for what we mentioned earlier, that they're warriors and magicians. I don't think we mentioned that. But Ma'aseh Akdamus story is something that is familiar to listeners, probably to an extent. Something Akdamus is read on Shavuos, and this is kind of historical legend story that's associated with it. So, first, if you want to relay the story, and then we can get into, the Red Jews part in that story.
So Ma'aseh Akdamus is one of the most popular stories about the Red Jews. Basically, first of all, it's the story about the creation of the Piyut Akdamut Milin, which was written by Rav Meir Shatz of the city of Worms. And in Ma'aseh Akdamus is not the contemporary title of the story. Actually, it's a title given by scholars to it. And the legend about the Piyut Akdamut Milin is in Yiddish, and it's basically about a Christian hater of the Jews. In some versions, he's described as called Black Monk, and this hater of the Jews kills many thousands of Jews by magic, by black magic, by just looking at them. And the Jews first, to save themselves, go to the emperor, and the story is in some versions clearly set in Germany. So they go to the emperor to protect them. The emperor cannot protect them. Then they go and fast and repent and to ask God for help. Also, it doesn't work. And then the black magician says, okay, I will do the Jews no more harm if within 1 year they can find somebody, a Jewish magician, who can compete with me in a magical contest, and if he can defeat me, I will not harm them anymore. I will not kill any more Jews, but if I win, I will kill them all. So the Jews know about their brothers beyond the Sambatyon, the red Jews, who are, according to this legend, famed as magicians. So they ask Rav Meir Shatz of Worms to function as a messenger and travel beyond the Sambatyon to ask the red Jews for help. He goes beyond the Sambatyon. There he meets the red Jews, and the red Jews sent one of them to come with Meir Shatz back to Germany, to Worms, and to compete with the black magician. And of course, this red Jew is victorious over the magician, and thereby he saves all the Jews in Europe from the black magician. And here we come to the piyut. Rav Meir Shatz, actually, who was not able to return together with the red Jews to Worms because he could not get over the Sambatyon. Again, as I said before, it's only quiet during the Shabbat, and before he could cross because it was Pikuach Nefesh, but afterwards he was not allowed to cross again. So he stayed beyond the Sambatyon. But he wrote, according to legend, the piyut Akdamut Milin and give it to the red Jew to bring it back to his hometown in Worms. And in praise of the events, he asked that his community in Worms would from now on read or recite this piyut every year on Shavuot. So that's how the red Jews come into the story of the Akdamut Milin.
Yeah, and some of the story listeners are probably familiar with. I knew growing up as a kid. You hear they couldn't. Rav Meir Shatz went over Pikuach Nefesh. He couldn't come back, and then he never comes back. And the story is actually talks about the wife comes to the red Jew, and he says, "What happened to my husband?" And they have to support her, and all that stuff.
And then the red Jew marries the daughter of Meir Shatz in Worms, and I think beyond the Sambatyon, the Meir Shatz marries the daughter of the red Jew. So they are at the same time father-in-law and brother-in-law. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, they become related, which is interesting. Another thing is, first of all, I already mentioned in your book you include an early manuscript version of Ma'aseh Akdamus that you translated. You do a complete translation into English as an appendix, and there's a lot of Ma'aseh Akdamus discussion in the book. But something very interesting, and I don't remember if you mentioned this on the podcast or before we started talking about, we mentioned they're called the red Jews, the Rote Juden, but they're also called like the little red Jews, not only red Jews. And the Jew in the story Ma'aseh Akdamus, he's considered called the little red Jew. That's what he's called. Why is he called the little red Jew?
Actually, that's the key to the entire Yiddish story, because in early modern Yiddish, the red Jews are always called red Jews, not little red Jews. Only this one red Jew in the story, who becomes in the end the savior, he is called little. And in Ma'aseh Akdamut, he's limping. He's an old, fragile man. And so when he comes to Worms or to this magical contest, both Jews and Christians, they wonder how should this little limping old man save us? How can he be victorious over the black, strong, mighty magician? And this is exactly where the Yiddish story links being read to David, because the Yiddish story about the red Jews is a retelling also of the motif of David fighting Goliath. So it's another story about how the little ones or the weak can be victorious over the mighty. So this is why the little red Jew is little and weak, and in the end he's the one who still kills the monk.
Now, as an aside, Rav Meir Shatz really existed?
You should have another podcast series on TLT. He did exist, and he was one of the famous Paitanim in Germany, and he's most famous for the Piyut Akdamut Milin, where in the Piyut you also find the acrostic of his name.
Yeah, just to clarify for the listeners, it's he exists. The story is kind of the legend. It's a story, it's a legend, and it comes up all over. When is the earliest that we see the story in manuscript? We see the origins of this story.
The origins of this story are much earlier than the first written sources we have. The oldest source, and this is also the manuscript that I included in a translation in the appendix to my book, is from the late 16th century, around 1580. And that's also the oldest text I have in Yiddish about the Red Jews. But clearly, with most Yiddish legend of this kind of material, these texts were before, for decades or centuries even, transmitted orally. It was a story that was told and retold, and then at some point was written down, perhaps or probably even in Hebrew, and then later retranslated into Yiddish. So we can assume, but unfortunately I didn't find those older Hebrew versions, but I have sources saying that Ma'aseh Akdamus was included in old medieval machzorim in Hebrew. So if anybody knows any medieval machzor where you can find a Ma'aseh Akdamus, I would be very happy to hear about it.
So you can understand the popularity of Ma'aseh Akdamus to the Jews of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, the kind of downtrodden Jews there, and why this would be something so popular. How do the Christians engage with this Ma'aseh Akdamus? Do we see it make its way at all into the German literature?
I think no. If I remember correctly, what I wrote in my book, no. We don't have, let's say, German translations of Ma'aseh Akdamus. No. So this is the Yiddish adaptation of the Yiddish reaction towards the Yiddish story, and also in the time that Ma'aseh Akdamus and all the Yiddish stories really pick up, and the Red Jews motif pops up in different genres in Yiddish literature. As I said before, it was already declining in German culture.
Now, there's a parallel that you draw is between Ma'aseh Akdamus and Toldos Yeshu, another kind of, it's a work that's around in manuscript, kind of never printed at the time.
Right, and we can say it was another most popular story in Yiddish, Toldot Yeshu. Toldot Yeshu, for those who do not know, is basically Jewish polemical counter story of the life of Jesus. And Jesus, Yeshu, in Toldot Yeshu, is depicted as a son of an unclean woman, as a magician, as an illegitimate child, as an impostor. So he's depicted very negatively, and actually, Yeshu shares in the Jewish story shares many features with the Antichrist taken from Christian literature. And Toldot Yeshu was a very popular story among Jews, not only in Germany, also beyond the European diaspora, in both Yiddish and in Hebrew. And in Toldot Yeshu, we also have a magical contest, very similar to the magical contest we have in Ma'aseh Akdamus. Even the objects involved are similar. We have trees flying around. We have millstones, and what is, I would say, is the most remarkable parallel is that in Ma'aseh Akdamus, the black monk is identified with the Antichrist, and Also in Toldot Yeshu, as I said before, Yeshu is identified with the Antichrist. So in Toldot Yeshu, who's the one who defeats Yeshu or the Antichrist? He is Judas Iscariot. And Judas, in Christian imagination, interestingly, is the notorious red-headed Jew. So there you have this parallel. So in both stories, a redhead, the little red Jew, or in Toldot Yeshu, Judas defeats the Antichrist, Yeshu or the monk. So there's the parallel. And we can clearly see that motifs from Toldot Yeshu figure in Ma'aseh Akdamus.
Ma'aseh Akdamus also, some of the versions, depicts the red Jew, the little red Jew, as a great magician. And he kills a lot of the non-Jews via magic. He touches their forehead, they die. So that's not something that's I don't think it's in all of them, all of the editions, but that's in some of them. And that has to do with what we said earlier, that the red Jews are depicted or assumed to be great warriors and sometimes magicians as well.
Yes. Yeah, we have this in other Yiddish stories too, that we have one Yiddish story, for example, which reports or like describes how even the children of the red Jews can slaughter 1,000, and which is of course a motif from the Bible. So we have various depictions how they are feared, for example, by their Christian neighbors. I mentioned Prester John before. So yes, we have this is a motif which is widespread in Yiddish literature, like in Hebrew literature also. It's analogous to descriptions of the 10 tribes in Hebrew and other Jewish languages.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something in the book called the Vidu Vilt, another story, and there's other stories as well that have parallels to this. So Ma'aseh Akdamus, as you mentioned, in Yiddish, it's in Hebrew. Does it enter Ladino or Judeo-Arabic or other Jewish cultures, other Jewish languages as well?
Yes, it does in a variant, I would say, because what is very interesting, and I mentioned that before, the red Jews, they populate the Yiddish imagination. There are a few translations or adaptations in Hebrew. I have several manuscripts of the story in Hebrew, but what we can see, it was not popular in Hebrew. It was never printed in Hebrew. So I argue in the book that the visual code of the red Jews didn't work in Hebrew, because in Hebrew you had the term 10 lost tribes. You didn't need a new term like red Jews. And also much of the interpretation of the red Jews, and we spoke about it before, was tied to the German Yiddish understanding of the color red and how this legend developed. So there are Hebrew versions from the 17th and 18th century, but never very popular. And you ask about Judeo-Arabic and Ladino. Yes, I found in the Israel Folktale Archives in Haifa versions of the legend from Greece and Yemen. They were recorded by immigrants from these countries to the land of Israel or to the state of Israel, and they were collected in the Israel Folktale Archives at the University of Haifa. They were written down in Hebrew, but we can assume that the informants, they would have told them in their community of origin, they would have told them in Ladino or in Judeo-Arabic. And what we see here is those versions are clearly variants of Ma'aseh Akdamus and other red Jew stories. But what is interesting, they never used the term red Jews. They don't translate it into Yehudim, Admonim, or Adumim in Hebrew. They use 10 lost tribes or Jews beyond the Sambatyon or sons of Moses, something like this. But what we can see, and why I say it's variants of the story, is that also here we have a savior, an individual savior, a little savior, from beyond the Sambation who rescues a Jewish community in danger. And this is a motif which before the emergence of the Yiddish story about the Red Jews, we do not have in Hebrew literature. It's always the 10 lost tribes en masse or as a group, but it's never one savior who is also limited in some ways, who becomes a savior. So this is unique, and it comes from the Yiddish legend.
Now, regarding the Red Jews as a whole, what role does Messianism play in this? Because and you know, people that are oppressed. We're talking about Jews in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire. There's countless expulsions from various cities. There's pogroms. There's killing. I mean, this is a downtrodden people, to say the least. And and I have there's another episode in this series with Mati Ben Melech discussing kind of Messianism in the 14th, 15th century and the Sarasat Shvatim, but specifically as it relates to the Red Jews and just in general, which is the lost tribes for German Jews in this time. What role does that play?
It's a good question. Of course, it's the story about the Red Jews on one level is a messianic story because similar to the Christian imagination of the apocalypse, Jews imagined the 10 lost tribes or the Red Jews to come and save them, to sort of pave the way for the Messiah. So the Red Jews are an apocalyptical people, but at the same time, the Yiddish stories that we were discussing, which were so widespread, they also suggest, and I mentioned that before, that Jews, like their Christian counterparts, believe these Red Jews exist and not only come to their help at the end of times when the Messiah comes, but even before, it was sort of a last resort. If other things don't help, like appealing to the authorities, praying, there was maybe the option of enlisting help from the Red Jews. So it was, on the one hand, a comforting story, but it also was an empowering story. And I argue this in my book also, that it also told the Yiddish readers to stand up against oppression, and even before the Messiah comes. Not only wait till the Messiah will redeem the Jews, but even before, sort of be like a Red Jew and stand up to their oppressors.
So we spoke about how the Red Jew legend, how it changes into the Reformation period. What happens after that into modernity? Because what's interesting is, you know, I talked to people about the series here and there, and I mentioned different episodes, and I said Red Jews, and I think everyone is like, what is Red Jews? Red Jews, like Ma'aseh Akdamus, the story, I think, is very well known still today, at least among Jews. But Red Jews, that legend is kind of, I think, gone. I don't think people really know it at all. And this is something that you do trace in the book, is what happens to this legend throughout modernity. So we kind of discussed till the Reformation, the 16th century. I mean, what happens after that, and kind of just briefly, quickly, until modernity, until today?
In the 16th and 17th century, we have many manuscripts and prints of Ma'aseh Akdamus and the Red Jew story. So it was super widespread among Yiddish-speaking Jews in early modernity. And first it was, and then at some point it sort of moved into Eastern Yiddish. So you can say in 1805, I mark it as a metaphorical turning point, so to say, because then the last version of Ma'aseh Akdamus in Amsterdam was printed in the same year. The printings were taken over in Vilna and Warsaw. So it was, and during the 19th and 20th centuries, still the Red Jew story was printed in Yiddish and also in Hebrew for Yiddish-speaking Jews in Eastern Europe. So it was very much alive till the Shoah, and even now you can find printings. As you said, it's Ma'aseh Akdamus is very is very widespread. So you do find printings about Ma'aseh Akdamus in bookstores in Brooklyn and also in Mea Shearim. But those books, even if they are printed in Yiddish, they don't include the term Red Jews. They include the term 10 Lost Tribes. But you can see that the story survives, but without the term. So, this is for the Red Jews, for Ma'aseh Akdamus, and for the stories for the Red Jews. But what happened is, and this is something I discovered, and it was not so widely known, is that there were, of course, stories about the Red Jews by the founders of modern Yiddish fiction. Mendele, Sholem Aleichem, Yutle Peretz. They all write short stories about the Red Jews. And here they clearly draw on the roots of the story in Old Yiddish. So they know it. Like Mendele read Ma'aseh Akdamus. There's no doubt about it. But they also change how they understand the Red Jews. Because for them, they are not mighty warriors. For them, they're wandering Jews who are fragile and who needs to be rescued themselves. And then in modernity, in modern Hebrew literature, actually, and also Yiddish literature, there's also another strand. Like writers like Uri Tzvi Greenberg and Naftali Herz-Imber, the author of the Hatikva, they also draw on the motif of the Red Jews in their poems. And for them, the Red Jews are Zionist pioneers. They are muscular Jews. So what happens in short, when the Red Jews move into modernity in the 20th century, early 20th, late 19th century, they are picked up in modern Yiddish literature as weak, wandering Jews. And at the same time, they reappear in Zionist literature as muscular Jews.
Yeah, and you include in the book, which is nice, there's a fair amount of color pictures or photographs, and you have a couple of paintings of Marc Chagall, which are depicting Red Jews. There's actually one of a green Jew, as you mentioned this earlier. And then there's some other artists as well that you have. And you even have, the last thing is you have a Shrine to the Red Jews from 2012. There's like bottles of red milk and red, some interest. That's an interesting one. What's the story of that one? Again, listeners have to see it. It's in the book, but it's kind of it's like a shrine. It's interesting.
It's
not
super
a painting.
interesting. Yeah, I came across it. It's actually it's by the Brooklyn-based artist Michael Levine. He built in 2012. He built a shrine to the Red Jews in the refrigerator. And this piece of art, I think, is remarkable in two ways because it summarizes so much of the story of the Red Jews. First of all, it lives in Brooklyn amongst in a Hasidic neighborhood where people speak Yiddish, but he does not encounter the Red Jew story through speaking with his Hasidic neighbors, because as we said before, like the Red Jews, the story is not known anymore, not even among Yiddish speakers. But the artist discovered it through reading a scholarly book, the book that I mentioned before by Andrew Gow on the Christian Red Jews. And so it underlines that the Red Jews in Jewish imagination are lost today. And the other aspect where I think it's remarkable and it fits the Red Jews so well is that Michael Levine is a visual artist. And a lot of the power of the Red Jew story in Old Yiddish draws on its visual code, because the Red Jews were imagined. They were not only known to be Red Jews, but they were imagined, as I said before, with red hair, red clothes. And pre-modern culture, both Jewish and Christian culture, was very tentative to the power of sight. And the power of sight was used for didactic purposes, for pedagogical purposes. And also we know today from modern scientific studies that looking at something colorful activates the same regions in your brain as imagining some color. So medieval and early modern authors, they already knew about this power of sight, of color, and it was employed in much of medieval and early modern literature, color symbolism, for example. So yeah, and that's why I conclude the book with the red juice in the Brooklyn fridge, because I think here the story comes full circle.
So the series is called The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. And I think as like a final question here, the red Jews, as we said, today it's kind of a lost kind of a legend, a story. But in Jewish consciousness, how important is the red Jews? And therefore, for listeners to get to know a little bit about it, to read your book, perhaps to learn about the red Jews, I mean, this is a really important, would you say this? It is a really important part of the story of the 10 Lost Tribes staying in Jewish consciousness and also maybe coming there to some of the Jews in some of these lands, you know, keeping them in their mind, the Lost Tribes.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think the red Jews is a great example of stories in the diaspora that circulated, which were invigorating, which were empowering, and it's a great way to engage with major discourses in Jewish history through a folk tale, basically through a story who the people who retold it, listened to it, were ordinary people. So I think this is what makes the Red Jew story so important. It's not a story that was told by rabbis how to perceive living in Europe during the early modern period or in the Middle Ages, but it was a story that was read and retold by ordinary people, by men who didn't know Hebrew but only read Yiddish, by women, by children. So this is why we have an additional perspective, an additional lens on Jewish life in the pre-modern world.
Correct. And it's a really interesting story and very interesting to know about, especially something that associated with the Lost Tribes that's not really well known today. And there's other aspects I'm sure we didn't get to that you delve into in your book. Also, one final note is that the cover art is really cool on the book. It comes to Red Jews in League with the Amazons, and it comes from a German illuminated manuscript, which is really interesting. So there'll be a link in the show's notes where you can purchase the book, but click on the link and check out the picture of the cover just to see that, like you were saying, you kind of see that art, you see that visualization of the Red Jews. And I'll put a link. I said try to find. I'm sure I can find online somewhere to the stained glass in the church in Frankfurt on the Oder, but the cover of the book also, you really see that depiction. It really comes across well of how they envision the Red Jews. So it's worth looking at, worth seeing.
I always wanted to find a visual artist who would agree to draw a comic book about the Red Jews, because I think it's Ma'aseh Akdamus and also the visualization of the Red Jews. It would be a wonderful project, but so far I haven't found anybody. But I hope at some point I will do it.
Yeah, and in the book also, we discussed the Ma'aseh Akdamus story. Listeners are familiar, but you have a full translation of it in an appendix, and you do analyze it almost like line by line. There's a lot of analyzation of it and the specifics and all, like you said, turning it into a comic book, kind of like the different variations of the story, and the magician is coming. It's very interesting to read.
It's like a film script. It's like a film script, the Ma'aseh Akdamus. So it would be very easy for somebody to adapt it into a movie, even the Ma'aseh Akdamus, or into a comic book.
It's really very interesting, and so I put a link to the show in the show's notes to the book, and hopefully listeners enjoyed it and they learned a little bit about the Red Jews and their part in the story of the 10 Lost Tribes, and again in Jewish consciousness, not the story of the Aseret Shvatim more so. That's why the name of the series is in Jewish consciousness. And so Thank you, Professor Voss, for joining me once again. And for the listeners, just a note here at the end again, there's another episode of Professor Voss's book on Disputed Messiahs. That was recorded first, but I don't know which one will end up being released first. So if that one was released first, go, check it out. If it wasn't, stay tuned. Thank you, Professor Voss, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me.